So far, we have looked at the nature of the political community, how it arises, why it arises, what it's aimed towards, and so on. What we're going to turn our attention to, starting with this video and then going forward into next week, is what a good political community looks like. What is a good one of these things that we've just been talking about, right? So we've talked very generally so far about the nature of the political community. That's Aristotle's political naturalism. Aristotle's political naturalism doesn't really tell us yet what exactly a good political community is going to look like, how it's going to be structured. That's what we're going to turn our attention to now. The way Aristotle approaches this issue is by talking about constitutions. Because in his view, different political communities communities can be arranged or ordered in different ways. And the Constitution is something like the form or order or arrangement of the citizens, of this multitude of citizens. Well, what's a citizen? What exactly is a citizen? Aristotle wants to say his answer, and we'll talk about this in detail as we go forward. It's someone who participates in deliberative and judicial office. More intuitively, it's someone who participates in the political community, right? A constitution is a multitude. It's the kind of arrangement of those kinds of people. That's Aristotle's view. And he wants to say there are different kinds of constitutions. Now, when we think, so to get a sense of what he's getting at here, when we think about the Constitution, I think most of us tend to think about something like the Bill of Rights, right? The rights that are guaranteed to us citizens and so on. But that's, I mean, if you just think about it for 2 seconds, the amendments or the Bill of Rights are amendments, and the amendments are things added on after the fact. They're added on to the Constitutions. The Constitution proper is all the stuff that comes earlier. And what is that stuff? Well, I don't know. There's like you got to be 25 to be a representative and 35 to be a president. I don't know, stuff like that, right? Well, start thinking about it a little bit. That's the kind of thing Aristotle is talking about. A constitution is an order or arrangement of citizens. What does that mean? A constitution says who can participate in the political life of the community and to what extent. Who has what rights and liberties? Who is able to vote on a piece of legislation, where legislation comes from, how representatives get elected, all that kind of thing. A constitution gives an arrangement or order to the citizens. It says who is a citizen. It says who is able to participate in deliberative office. It says who is able to participate in judicial office. Yeah, something like that is Aristotle's idea. And if the Constitution is different, well, you're going to have a different account of who can do those things. So in our Constitution, plain citizens are not allowed to vote on taxes, on who gets taxed, are not allowed to vote on who on going to war. That's part of our Constitution. I am not allowed to vote on that. The only people allowed to vote on that are members of the federal Congress, the United States Congress, right? They vote on that. Those particular people engage in that kind of activity. We engage in a different kind of activity, right? We vote for those people, right? That's a kind of participation in deliberative office, I think Aristotle would say, but it's different. And the Constitution lays that out. If our Constitution were different, if our Constitution were more similar to that of ancient Athens, for example, you and me, just plain citizens, would vote on those things. We would vote. The ancient Athenian citizens, they themselves voted on taxes, on foreign policy, whether or not to go to war with Sparta or whatever, right? And their constitution laid that out. So that's what Aristotle's getting at here. And it's, I think, a fairly intuitive idea, right? The Constitution is what it spells out who has what rights and abilities with regard to the political life of the community. Say a little bit more about it. I've been talking about deliberative office. I said something about voting. That's kind of what Aristotle identifies it with. He says something about he's really defining the citizen of a democracy. And so when he talks about voting there, he doesn't mean voting for a guy who will then go vote for, going to war with Sparta or whatever. He means directly voting on whether or not we go to war with Sparta. That's what a citizen does. But I think it also applies to the kind of thing that we are talking about, right? So American, you and me, other people born or naturalized in the United States, we engage in a kind of deliberative office in as much as we vote for the people who then make those decisions. Judicial office, well, that sounds like judges. You got to be a judge or something to be a citizen. Well, actually, curious thing, ancient Athens didn't have judges, so that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about serving on juries. So someone who votes either directly on matters of policy, that's really what he has in mind, or votes for the people who would then vote for matters of policy, vote on policies. That's deliberative office. Judicial office would be something like serving on juries. Right, and so so all peoples born and naturalized in the United States are citizens in this sense, maybe somewhat attenuated because we don't directly vote on policies. We are all eligible for jury duty. We're citizens. Yeah, that's kind of Aristotle's idea. And so the Constitution says who votes on policies, who is eligible to participate in these offices. If we had a tyranny or a dictatorship, right, it'd be very different. Maybe you and I and plain people run around we likely wouldn't be citizens. And in fact, Aristotle sometimes says things like this, that in a tyranny, there's precisely one citizen, the tyrant, because he does all the deliberating and all the judging, right? And so depending on the Constitution, you have, in different constitutions, different people will be citizens, yeah? Okay. Now, like I was saying, what we're interested in now is what a good political community looks like. Another way to think about that, what kind of a constitution would make a political community a good political community? And one way we're going to start addressing this is by looking at Aristotle's discussion in Book 3, Chapter 4, of the differences or the relationship between being a good citizen on the one hand and being a good human being on the other. There's a very famous discussion which compares being a good citizen and being a good human being. And the question he asks and answers, but the question he asks is whether the good citizen and the good human being are necessarily one and the same. If someone's a good human being, are they necessarily also a good citizen? And if someone's a good citizen, are they necessarily also a good human being? And Aristotle's answer to both those questions is no. The good citizen is not necessarily a good human being, and a good human being is not necessarily a good citizen. It all depends upon what the Constitution is. To illustrate this, he starts talking about what the virtue of a citizen is. So we're not talking about the virtue of a human being. We talked about that earlier, right? The virtues of a human being, of a person, would be things like generosity and justice and temperance and so on, things like that we discussed earlier. Look at Book 2, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. The virtue of a citizen is different. The virtue of a citizen is a character trait that helps preserve the regime or constitution, that helps keep it around, helps preserve it. That's what he says. So any characteristic of a person that helps preserve the regime, that's the virtue of a citizen. And if a citizen has that characteristic, has that trait, well, they're a good citizen. A good citizen is a citizen that has the virtue of a citizen. And the virtue of a citizen is any character trait that helps preserve the regime. And Aristotle's idea is that different traits help preserve different regimes. It depends upon the regime, depends upon the constitution. So in one constitution, one trait might be the virtue of a citizen, but in a different constitution, that same trait might not be the virtue of a citizen. It might actually make one a bad citizen, right? And so what the virtue of a citizen is dependent upon what the regime is, what the constitution is. Because the virtue of a citizen is any trait that helps preserve the regime. So let's illustrate this. Right. So different traits help preserve different kinds of regimes. Let's illustrate this with an example of oligarchy. So that's a pretty nice word, and you may have heard it before. Sometimes when people kind of criticize the United States, they say, "Oh, it's really just an oligarchy. We're not a democracy. We're an oligarchy." What is an oligarchy? Strictly speaking, what it means is it's derived from the Greek word, which means, archy is whatever. It's kind of rule, right? That's what that means. The olig part means a few, the rule of a few is basically what an oligarchy is, but it's actually more specific than that. It doesn't just mean the rule of a few. Oligarchy over time in ancient Greece came to mean something like, rule by a few who have a lot of money, rule by the people with all the money, right? And so when people complain that the United States is actually an oligarchy, what they're saying is, the people with the money, they run the show, they call all the shots. It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks or whatever, right? So oligarchy is really kind of rule by the wealthy, rule by the rich. That's what an oligarchy is. So that's a kind of regime. That's a kind of constitution, right? And in such a constitution, the only citizens are the few rich people. They are the people who make all the choices, who make all the judgments, who pass all the judgments. The few rich people, right? The oligarchs themselves. So, we'll get that in a second. What is the virtue of a citizen in an oligarchy? We'll put it up there now. I think Aristotle wants to say, well, look, we got to find some character trait that helps preserve the regime. Well, if an oligarchy is a regime in which only the few rich people have power, what kind of characteristic or character trait is going to help preserve that? What should a citizen in an oligarchy, which would be one of the oligarchic rulers, right? What kind of character trait would help an oligarchic ruler keep the oligarchy in power? Well, in the first place, it's probably going to be something like greed, right? Because if that wealth gets spread out to more people, well, then more people might qualify for rule. The stranglehold that the rich people have on rule is going to loosen. And so greed would seem to be the virtue of a citizen in an oligarchy. Why? Because it helps the citizen, it helps the oligarchic ruler preserve the regime, maintain the oligarchy. You keep all the rest of the people kind of crushed in poverty, right? That helps you preserve your regime. And so in an oligarchy, a good citizen is going to be a greedy person, right? Someone who keeps all the money to themselves, makes sure none of the other people get it. But of course, being greedy makes one a bad human being. That's one of the vices, stinginess or meanness, Aristotle calls it. It's opposed to the virtue of generosity. The good person is a generous person, according to Aristotle, right? The good human being, the good human is generous. And so what Aristotle would say is that in an oligarchy, a good human being, a generous person, would be a bad citizen. Why? Because in as much as they are generous, they would use their money appropriately. They wouldn't hold on to it. They wouldn't be greedy. And so they might spread it out a bit more. Well, that's going to tend to lead to the toppling of the oligarchy, right? They have a character trait that is liable to lead to the dissolution of the constitution, of the regime. And so a good person, a good human being, is not a good citizen in an oligarchy. And by contrast, as we were just talking about, right, a good citizen in an oligarchy is not a good person. To be a good citizen in an oligarchy requires a certain kind of ruthless greed. That makes you a bad person, however. That makes you a bad human being. And so now the question is going to be, is there a regime, a constitution, in which a good citizen and a good human being are one and the same? In which to be a good human being is to be a good citizen, and to be a good citizen is to be a good human being? Aristotle thinks there is, and it's what he describes in book 7. But Aristotle's view is that's ultimately what we need to be aiming for. A good political community will be a political community in which the good human being and the good citizen are one and the same, in which you don't find what we just found in the oligarchy. And so Aristotle would say all the stuff I was just talking about, the fact that the good citizen in an oligarchy is not a good human being and vice versa, all this is a sign that an oligarchy is a defective regime. It's a bad constitution as far as it goes.